Hoppaday geckos, this is Mrs. Delgado, and today I will be going over the slides previously discussed in class directly connected to the causes of the revolution. This will be completed in two parts, each part consisting of about 15 minutes, with this being the first recording. We have three learning objectives. The first being, we will know the different acts which angered the colonists. We will understand how those acts snowballed into the revolution. And lastly, we will be able to explain how government decisions impact its people. So it's somewhat scaffolded in that the first one, it deals with being able to identify all of the different acts and taxes and laws that have been imposed on the colonies. That's strictly just identifying them and being able to detail what they are. And then the next one will be able to, you will be able to understand how those snowballed and actually generated into a revolution. And then lastly, again, you're going to understand how government is able to impact its people through its decisions. But we'll begin with a bit of a review of the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. So as you can see here, this is a layout of the colonies in the 1740s, with the red indicating the colonies that belong to Great Britain or England, and then the blue, the colonies that belong to France, and then in the tan or beige, the colonies that belong to Spain. The red and the blue will be territories ceded by France to Great Britain by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which we did not cover, but that's just a bit of background information. Colonial clashes, so this again, we're still reviewing the French and Indian War. The Ohio Valley, which we had talked about, and I had given you a map in the previous presentation, became the main bone of contention. So we know that it was the Ohio River Valley in which basically the first conflict had initiated and took place. It was a critical area which the westward were pushing British colonists would inevitably penetrate. So we knew that the British colonies were beginning to move westward. And we also understand that it was cheap farmland to them. It was land that contained rivers and soil that was good for farming. And overall, it just allowed them to obtain more property. We know that George Washington was involved, and he was a young George Washington. He was a major, and he was asked by the Virginia government to go to the Ohio River Valley and to basically secure specific forts that belonged to the French. At the same time, the French were there constructing their forts in the Ohio River Valley, and we know that George Washington had left there unsuccessful. And this happened in the summer of 1754. And he was given the mission to take Fort Duquesne, which he had failed to do, and he ended up building Fort Necessity. And this was the first conflict that led to the war a couple of years later. After the French and Indian War, for the first time in 50 years, England was at peace. Yet they had accumulated a massive amount of debt. So we know that with war comes a lot of financial strain. You need to pay for a lot of the recovery methods that your country is going to have to take in order to recover from the war itself. They increased taxation of the colonies, and this was seen as justified. However, all of the people who had lived in England, they didn't need to pay those taxes. And the reason why they didn't feel they needed to is because they didn't benefit. They weren't living on the property of the 13 colonies, so they felt the colonists were due to pay those taxes. The Proclamation of 1763, and I am referring to this line right here, the Proclamation line of 1763. So this is that boundary that basically prior to the French and Indian War had divided the French territory from the British territory, but it's going to serve a different purpose post the war. After the war, it forbid the settlers, so it forbid the colonists, okay, to go beyond the Appalachian Mountains. It allowed England, rather than the colonial government, to governments to control westward expansion. So pretty much the colonists that lived in this eastern area were not allowed to go and approach beyond that line. And again, the reason why is because they did not want any more conflict with the Native American tribes. The Indians like this line a lot, and when I say Native Americans, I will use that term as well as the Indian term interchangeably. So when I use them, I mean them in one and the same, just for historical purposes. So the Native Americans really liked this line because it meant that the colonists were supposed to stay almost like a playpen, almost as though they were in timeout. They weren't allowed to leave this territory. However, by and large, the results were that that line inevitably failed. And of course, we know that the colonists were wanting to gain more territory, and they were not, unfortunately, going to listen to a king who was thousands of miles away or a government that was thousands of miles away in a different country. It had minimal effect on limited colonial expansion, which meant that the Parliament, which is the British government, and the Crown, they weren't able to keep the colonists from moving past this proclamation line of 1763. The settlers continued to swarm across the boundary and to claim lands further into the Ohio River Valley. So even though they had this proclamation line and this agreement that they were to stay in that eastern area, they still went and crossed over in search of more territory. And it wasn't being policed by British troops, so even more so, they were very loose regulations and that people were not following those regulations. And we're going to begin with the Sugar Act of 1764. Now, the Sugar Act of 1764 was the first act, the first set of taxes, I should say, that were imposed on the colonists, but it wasn't a direct tax. When I say it wasn't a direct tax, meaning that it wasn't a tax that was needed to be paid for by the people who are purchasing the sugar. The people who had to pay the tax were the merchants themselves, and so therefore it's not considered a direct tax. It's almost like the store having to pay a tax, but the people who purchase from the store do not have to pay it. Now, this was a tax on sugar, molasses, wine, even coffee. And this was a tax that they never had to pay prior to. So you can imagine what outrage they had when all of a sudden after the war they had to pay these taxes that they never had to pay before. It was also designed to eliminate the illegal sugar trade. So what the British government, what Parliament and the Crown saw was happening was as a means to avoid these taxes because they didn't have to pay them before, the colonists were engaging in an illegal sugar trade between themselves and other areas in the French and Spanish West Indies. So they were smuggling sugar as a way to avoid the British tax. Now, of course, the Parliament and the Crown ended up finding out that the colonies were smuggling in sugar, and this is because unfortunately they had people who were pretty much tattletelling on them and reporting to the British government that they were smuggling in sugar as a means to avoid the tax. Well, in order to battle that, what they did was they strengthened the Crown and Parliament ended up strengthening the enforcement on sugar. So they sent people and they ordered people to really police those who were trying to smuggle the sugar into the colonies. And in addition to that, not only did they further police it and further deepen their regulations and strengthen those regulations, but they also created a court system that would try smugglers who were caught sneaking in sugar illegally as a means to avoid paying the taxes. So that's the first one. The next act is going to be the Currency Act of 1765. And this one was the colonists had been printing their own money at that time, and they really believed that they were independent. They had been governing themselves for a lengthy amount of time. Although they were still under the British government, they took great pride in their independence. And one of the pieces of evidence of their independence or their slow gaining independence was the fact that they had their own money. So they were very proud of that, and they held to that. But the Currency Act of 1765 regulated that they had to begin using British forms of money as opposed to using their own currency, and they had to retire all of their paper money, and they had to stop its circulation. and they could only use the currency being used in England. The colonial responses to acts. What I'm going to do is I'm going to skip this part and we're going to focus on the next slide. And that former slide that I had placed in there, that was we're not going to include that in any quizzes or tests. Instead, I added other pertinent information that I felt would correlate with that just as well. Now I'm going to get into the Stamp Act of 1765. The Stamp Act required that merchants and lawyers required to buy stamps for ships, papers, and legal documents. Now, what I'm going to do is on this slide, it lists a bunch of examples, but altogether, the Stamp Act was pretty much a tax on anything dealing with paper, and they would have to purchase this stamp, and this stamp would be placed on newspapers and magazines and journals and even playing cards. Like I mentioned, anything dealing with papers, business licenses, contracts, and these were people who were very educated, obviously, merchants and lawyers, and they were having to pay these taxes. Now, the stamp itself didn't cost a lot of money. It was really just the principle of the matter that all of a sudden they were having to pay these taxes or pay these fees that they never had to pay before. So other examples are printers for newspapers, which I had mentioned. Actual stamp tax was not expensive, but again, it was the principle of the matter. They knew that England was using this as kind of a fundraiser, a reason to raise money. So of course the colonists were upset at this idea. Patrick Henry, who was part of the House of Burgesses, he called for a repeal of the tax, and he informed the British government, he informed Parliament that if they did not repeal the tax, then the king would face a mutiny. So they're already demonstrating that their anger towards these acts and these taxes. The Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were formed in 1765 in Boston, Massachusetts, and they were a terrorist organization of colonists. And what they did was they would attack stamp agents, obviously out of anger, and they would harass these stamp agents, and they would be very violent and volatile, and they really resented them because of what they represented, which was basically the work of Parliament and the king, and trying to take away the independence of the colonies. They destroyed the lieutenant governor's home. They would go on to be a very powerful underground colonial terrorist group in Massachusetts. The Townshend Acts. I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to stop the recording here, and I will post the Townshend Acts as well as the assignments that you are going to complete. I will go ahead and post that in the second part of this recording, so be on the lookout for that. So I'm going to end it right here.